welcome to our monthly U.S. Politics and Policy Review, a joint program of the Perth USAsia Center at the University of Western Australia and the United States Studies Center at the University of Sydney. Both of us are sister centers under the sponsorship or support of the American Australian Association, and this is a long-standing collaboration that we're delighted to do. I'm particularly delighted to continue the conversation with my partner in crime in this endeavor, Professor Simon Jackman, who's the CEO of the United States Studies Center. Before we continue, allow me to acknowledge the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet. In the case of the University of Western Australia, the Whadjuk people of the Noongar Nation, if I'm correct, Simon, you can correct me. In the case of the University of Sydney, the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. Though we're virtual, we still want to pay our respect to their elders, past, present, and emerging. As we kick off this month's conversation, we're especially delighted to have a guest speaker join us. We're delighted to have a multiple award-winning journalist, Ms. Elise Hu, who's currently an editor-at-large at NPR West in California, also serves as a reporter for Vice News, and is the host of TED Talks Daily podcast. I had a wonderful opportunity to cross paths with Elise personally when she was serving as the first bureau chief of the National Public Radio in Korea, covering Korea and Japan, and I've followed her reporting closely since then. For those in our Australian audience who don't know, the National Public Radio, or NPR, is probably the closest thing the United States has to ABC. And in its reporting, it really has something that influenced my life. The 25 years I spent in Washington, D.C., it meant that NPR was my companion for my morning commute and my evening commute. And those of you who have dealt with Washington, D.C. traffic knows that means I had a lot of NPR over the course of 25 years. But we're really happy to have Elise with us to talk through what is an awful lot of issues impacting American politics and policy today. You will notice a stray y'all popping out of Elise during the course of it. She was born in Missouri, but raised in Texas. She was started her broadcast career in the broadcast media in Texas, but is also one of the founding journalists behind the online Texas Tribune. And so we might throw a couple of Republic of Texas questions towards you as well, Elise. But first, delighted to have you with us on the call, particularly from California. Can we just kind of open it up with your initial observations of what are you following in the U.S. today? How do things look on the ground from Los Angeles?
Well, thank you so much to all of you in Australia for having me. I hope the future is bright since you were already in Friday and I'm still on Thursday night. And I want to preemptively apologize that I am not at my most cogent because it is the end of a long day and my children have just returned to school in real life about a week and a half ago. So that's kind of the state of life here in California, USA, which is we have been in rather, I guess, the most draconian and strict lockdowns along, on the US coast, on the West Coast and on the East Coast. And so schools have just reopened. Primary and secondary school in real life for kids about a week and a half ago. So we are slowly emerging from the pandemic here. And since Inauguration Day at the end of January, it's been rather strange to not have US politics at the top of mind every single day, because the thing about the Trump era was that every day was the Trump show. I mean, he so needed to be the center of attention every single day that our worlds all revolved around him and our attention all revolved around him. And really, you could even tell when he was kicked off of Twitter how much, and he wasn't able to command that social media attention anymore. And subsequently, the mainstream media couldn't write stories about his tweets anymore. There was a difference. There was a real palpable difference felt in the amount of attention and emotional energy we were giving to the former president. And so we have been enjoying in the last few months just this period of rather quiet and competent governance, a president who seems to display empathy sometimes, as they should, and then communicates with the American people in the traditional ways, like press releases and through the presidential daily brief, through a press secretary. And so a lot of norms that were abandoned in our disorienting previous 4 years are slowly returning. And I think that has allowed for a lot of American voters to sort of take a breath. But at the same time that we're seeing governance and this period of governance, there's this whole other reality going on, right? I mean, 70% of Republican voters believe in the quote unquote big lie that that the election results are not legitimate. And Republicans really effectively have not offered a counter argument to that. There is no counter argument on the Republican side to the big lie. And the people who have attempted to just say, no, the election was real, it did happen and Donald Trump did lose, are really getting ousted. I mean, today marks, in some commentators have observed that today, Thursday, May 6th, marks kind of the capitulation of the Republican Party to a complete cult of personality to Donald Trump, because today is the day that, on the same day that both the states of Florida and Texas passed rather draconian voter suppression laws, we are also seeing Liz Cheney, the number 3 daughter of Dick Cheney, and very conservative in her political positions, being ousted from her leadership as House leadership, because she basically spoke up against Donald Trump and the big lie. And so it's really fascinating that 70% of Republicans in the United States, and just an entire swath, 35 to 40% of Americans, are living and believing a completely different set of facts and are protected by that in a bubble, right? An ecosystem that was started with talk radio and then grew in the 1990s with Fox News. And so, on one hand, it's been pretty impressive to be able to take a breather a little bit and be under a competent governance. And on the other, it's very worrying that there is a huge swath of America that believes in a completely different set of information. And I won't say different set of facts, because they aren't facts.
Well, what a way to start off the conversation. And I want to come back to the quiet, and I want to come back to the 100 days, but you've actually hit on something that is highly topical for today. So let's continue with that and bring Simon into the conversation. Simon, you've done an awful lot of polling work, and you follow very closely the trends within the Republican Party in particular. Can you give us your views on what's happening today? I mean, today does seem, it seems kind of trite to call this, a turning point of the Republican Party, because it's been turning for an awful long period of time. Maybe Custer's last stand with Mitt Romney and Liz Cheney kind of standing in the role of Custer. What's your view of the state of play?
I think it's the substantive import of these changes that Republican state legislatures are making to access to the polls in their respective states. It hasn't penetrated, Australian headlines at all, Gordon. We're very much focused on domestic use here, domestic politics, COVID, what's happening in India, the fact we had a COVID case or 2 COVID cases here in Sydney yesterday. And I think there's been the quiet coming out of the US has meant that sort of high level of attentiveness that Australians had to all things US domestic politics has demonstrably waned. But if I would identify one thing that I think has got really potentially profound long-term consequences, and frankly, it has ethical and moral and normative consequences as well, it'd be this reaction to the election loss among Republican state legislatures to take, frankly, what is an undemocratic step to limit access to the polls, to tighten that up in the absence of any compelling evidence at all of fraud, that there's a problem. The problem is that as the electorate grows, Republicans, at least as they're currently configured, struggle to win elections in places they've become used to winning them. The solution, not to change the message, but to change the electorate through draconian, frankly, measures limiting access to the polls. It cuts against the grain, Gordon, as well, having spent a lot of time in Australia and now dual national yourself. In Australia, we go the other way. There's a bipartisan consensus around compulsory turnout. We have elections on a Saturday because it's
Wild.
compulsory. Yeah, you're right, Elise. We make it.
To me, I'm just like, what?
I know. We make it really easy to vote because it's compulsory, right, to do so. California has a regime of if you move in state, your voter registration will almost surely follow you around. If you know, particularly if you change your driver's license or things like that in state. But that is increasingly the norm across state borders as well in Australia. So we're sort of the other way. So it's very striking to Australian ears to hear this, that this is what's going on. And moreover, it sort of wedges Australian conservatives from their conservative cousins in the US, as it were, because no Australian conservative, it's absolutely there's almost no one on the right of Australian politics that thinks compulsory voting, compulsory turnout is a problem. Every now and then that surfaces in Australian political debate, but it's sort of not an issue at the moment. But Elise, I want to ask about the quiet, and that is, how is it, in your view, that Trump has this pull still on the party, given that he's been taken off social media? That's one thing from this distance here in Australia. I don't have a great read on. You take Trump away from the social media platforms. He's not on TV, at least not as much as I'm seeing. Maybe he's doing more on Fox or something. Do you have a theory as to why 5 months past January now, into May, he continues to have this amazing hold over the base of the Republican Party?
Well, the pithy answer, I suppose, is that because they don't believe he lost the election. Right? I mean, he's not getting attention, but the base remains enamored of him because they believe that he should be the president still, right? I mean, that's not just true of QAnon. It's true of people like Kevin McCarthy, the House Minority Leader, who did not vote to certify the election results, much like much of the Republicans in the House. So unless Donald Trump is indicted, which is a possibility. I mean, there are criminal and civil cases getting built against him, or somehow incapacitated. I can't imagine a scenario where Trump doesn't run again, or try to run again, or at least flirt with running again in 2024. He loves to stay in the news, and the best way to stay in the news for Donald Trump is to flirt with running for president, right? It helps him, if he does face any sort of prosecution, to say that it's a political prosecution. So even if the next presidential nominee in the United States isn't Donald Trump, whoever the next nominee out of the Republican Party is, will talk like Trump and act like Trump and kind of be like Trump, because no one will speak up for the truth, right? It's pretty astounding that the Republican Party today sort of doesn't have, or the future of the Republican Party doesn't really have a moral center, and there's no counter argument against Trump. I'm still rather alarmed by this because I suppose, in my late 30s, I came up in a time where there were still kind of collective facts that we all agreed on, and that has it's bifurcated, and it's really difficult to sort of operate in this environment, both as a journalist, but also as an American who is from flyover country, as they call it, places like Missouri, the state where I was born, and then deep red Texas, where not only is there not a shared belief in kind of political realities, but there's a real kind of disbelief in facts like science. And so, anti-maskers in America are also astounding. And I think that's going to keep us from being able to reach herd immunity.
I think I probably have a slightly less charitable take than you, Elise, on this, and where your description of, they continue to support Trump because they believe he won the election might apply to, the viewership of Sean Hannity's show or Tucker Carlson's show out in the patients. But the elected officials themselves are, at least in my view, putting themselves in a much less favorable light today. So when you talk about people like Kevin McCarthy and the rest of the Republican House leadership, who on January 6th and 7th and 8th all clearly, had stated that Trump had lost the election, that he'd gone too far, and that the insurrection and the attack on the U.S. Capitol stepped too far. And one by one themselves kind of went back into it. And today, some of the analysis of what's happening to Liz Cheney, and for those of our viewers who don't know this, Liz Cheney is currently third in leadership of the minority in the House, the Republican leadership. And by all accounts, by early next week, she's likely to lose that position. She will be voted out because not only do the other members of the Republican House leadership, but the rank and file are all deeply embarrassed by her, because her willingness to stand up and call Trump's continued allegations that the election was stolen the big lie, and to directly call him out, puts them in a very unfavorable light because they've gone the other direction. Whereas I don't think that Kevin McCarthy believes that the election was stolen. They know full well this is more of a political tool on their part. And this is where I'm going back to your question, Simon. Maybe I'll put your own question back to you, because I actually still don't get, how they are not. Is it pure cowardice? Is it a political calculation where they recognize the continuing pull of the media means that they can't afford to cross Trump? But you would think that there would be more of them trying to do what Liz Cheney is doing, which Mitch McConnell has done with some hesitancy, what Mitt Romney is doing. Is it just that they tried it and the cost was too painful early on, and so they backed away? What's the explanation there?
I'll give a glib answer and then quickly see if Elise's got a view on this, Gordon. The glib answer is your cousin, Jeff Flake. So Elise,
there's a cautionary tale there, right?
Well,
you are not rewarded, right? As a Republican, you are not rewarded by your constituents for standing up against this guy or standing up to this guy.
You are punished.
And it's so funny. The irony here is that there is such loyalty among the Republican base to Donald Trump, who might be the most disloyal person in public life ever. Like, who? The paradox here is astounding to me.
Now, for me, one of the most, again, sad things this week is to see, Mike Pence come out this week trying to have his own personal emergence and give his speech and remaining as close as possibly can to Trump. And meanwhile, the same day, Trump continues to hammer Mike Pence. It is an interesting. Hey, well, look, we could go on far too long on that topic. I actually want to take it at a slightly more analytical level. Let's go back to this question of the ongoing tension between efforts to suppress the vote and tremendous efforts to kind of mobilize and get out the vote. Because voter suppression is not new in the United States. Simon, you yourself have done a lot of research and writing on gerrymandering and testified on court cases on that front. So that's been happening for a long time. This seems to be a little bit different. Republicans took over a lot of state houses back in 2010. Now I think there's no fewer than 29 states that are passing efforts that specifically make it harder to vote, make it harder for minorities to vote, make it harder for working class to vote, make it harder to vote on Sundays, et cetera. And there's a tension between that effort and the effort of others like Stacey Abrams in Georgia to turn out historic numbers of votes to turn states kind of early. Elise, let's go back to you to start on that process. How do you see that long-term tension between these two efforts that are characterizing American politics today?
I think when I speak to international audiences, one thing that really blows people's minds, and especially when I speak to other sort of democracies, is that, and this is really important foundationally in terms of framing this conversation, is that America does not have proportional representation. Rural states with smaller populations have 2 senators, but California and New York, which are giant states, also have 2 senators each. And so and rural areas tend to be more conservative and tend to vote more conservative, and that polarization has widened. And so what we've seen over the last 10, 20 years is the American politics, so our legislature and our electeds, being far more to the right and far more conservative than the American populace at large, right? And so and that tension is really fascinating. So for Republicans, in order for Republicans to maintain power and their positions of power, they have to essentially make it harder and harder for people to vote, and for more dense places, urban areas, where we're more politically liberal, to be less represented or not represented fairly. And that's where gerrymandering comes in. districts in all US states are drawn by state legislatures based on the census, which comes out every 10 years. And so we are now we're now following the 2020 census. And so state legislatures, which happen to be, majority of them are controlled by Republicans, are going, and most of them don't have bipartisan redistricting commissions that draw these lines. And so in most cases, Republicans in state legislatures, and a lot of them are, usually they're not politicians, like it's not their day job to really be governing is not their day job. They'll be, pig farmers from West Texas, or just very sort of politically motivated people who will then get to draw lines and decide the very borders under which members of Congress are going to be able, or members of Congress represent, right? And so we are headed into that. And due to redistricting alone, Democrats are likely to lose the next midterm election in 2022 because they are currently holding a lot of districts that where a lot of Republican voters dwell, and Biden overperformed in some areas. So we are kind of that is the backdrop of all of this.
Well,
then,
Simon, go ahead.
And then enter the southern states that are making it more difficult to vote. They are passing, it's not just not compulsory to vote in the United States, right? Yeah. They actively make it hard. They are closing polls early. They are ending early voting in some places, or starting early voting a day or two later. And they're playing at the margins here that make a huge difference in close elections. And so you have that going on. On the flip side, there is something called HR 1 right now, which is a huge omnibus voter reform, or voting. It's called the John Lewis for the People Act, and there's no chance that it will pass because it includes campaign finance reform and all sorts of really sweeping changes that would allow the federal government to come in and make it much easier to vote. But without some sort of reform, then we are headed into a really dangerous situation in which, because of so much suppression going on in red states, there are margins that are going to be impossible for even the ground game, like Stacey Abrams' successful effort in Georgia, to overcome.
Well, Simon, as a political scientist, you'll understand that we can get distracted by the day-to-day opinion polls that show Biden doing quite well, 65% approval on some issues. And yet what Elise has just described seems to be the underlying ground game, which is going to have a far heavier impact in 2022. Can you give us your prognosis for how is this playing out between now and the next midterm elections, which are strangely just 18 months away?
Yeah.
Well, what plays out between now and then, I think, is, I think the Democrats are probably staring a reality in the face, and that is they are likely to lose both chambers in the midterm. So what can they get done now? And for Biden in particular, Gordon and Elise, I'd be, he was there during Obama's first 2 years as vice president. And I think, the conventional wisdom from Democrats that I talk to is that, look, the lesson of 2010 and Democrats losing control of Congress in the 2010 midterms, and everybody going, well, it's because Obamacare was so wildly unpopular. A lot of Democrats, the takeout is, well, damn, if we were going to lose the House on the back of that we shouldn't have tried to compromise at all. Go hard while you can, and if you end up losing, if we'd actually got the policy we really wanted, we might have not had we got a bad political outcome because we got a bad policy outcome. Is sort of one version of it. I don't know about that, but it's certainly something that I think Democrats will be mindful of. What can they get done that doesn't need 60 votes in the Senate? And that's why this HR 1 is, there's no way HR 1, you can't consider HR 1 a budget bill and get it done through reconciliation. So HR 1 needs 60 votes. So that's gone. But how about this infrastructure bill? How about other things like that? What can we get done? Where we'll take advantage of the fact that we might be able to, Senate parliamentarian turns out to be the most powerful person in America right now, making these decisions about what's a budget bill or what's not, what only needs 50 votes in the Senate. So I think Democrats are looking at this window they've got now to not let, compromise policy and the mediocre political results that it produces. If we're going to lose, go out guns blazing, they're probably going to lose, right? So that's it. They're not lining up to like lemmings to jump off a cliff. I think you'll find moderate Democrats, really putting some handbrakes. And we've already seen that. Manchin didn't want the minimum wage piece in the COVID recovery legislation that got taken down. We'll see where they land on corporate tax rates to pay for the infrastructure stuff that's on the table as well. But I think, between now and the election, Gordon, in anticipation of just how narrow those margins are, given what's coming down the pike with gerrymandering, given what's coming down the pike with restricted ballot access, but given what ordinarily happens in a midterm where turnout goes down, that's probably not going to be good for Dems. If given all that, go hard, frankly, and that's why these billions of dollars and that incredibly ambitious climate plan and a lot of spending, lots of carrots, not a lot of climate sticks. They're not going to legislate a carbon price, but taking advantage of the COVID crisis to really make some progress on some big and frankly long overdue infrastructure spending and infrastructure plus spending in the US.
Well, thank
Yeah,
you,
we
Simon.
should point out that the president's party, historically, the president's party has only won the midterm following the election of that president 3 times in American history. And one was the second term or the re-election of Bill Clinton. The other one was George W. Bush following 9/11. And then before that, it was FDR. So it's not likely that the Democrats can hold on to things.
Although there is some hope for Democrats in that if you look at
1998
for the Democratic side, they won largely on the back of what was perceived to be Republican overreach, right, in terms of their response. So, but hey, look, this segue, Simon's focus on Democrats having learned the lesson of the early part of the Obama administration, 2009, 2010, deciding to go hard, gives us a perfect chance to kind of look at the 100-day mark. Last Thursday it marked 100 days in the Biden administration. And while obviously this is nothing like FDR, right? And that's our traditional, measuring piece. FDR passed 77 laws, signed them into law, 74 different executive actions, and fundamentally remade the American economy. And yet, by most comparisons, the Biden first 100 days was pretty remarkable in his own term. Only 11 bills signed into law, but among those 11 bills was a $1.9 trillion COVID relief package. And I always remind our Australian audiences to give that some context. Our entire gross domestic product for a year is $1.4 trillion. So $1.9 trillion package is not jump change here in terms of the process. Let's start with you again, Lise. The 100-day mark, and why don't we wrap into that the speech to the joint session of Congress? It has been a different 100 days. You used the term quiet, but there's been more than a little happening during that period of quiet as well. What's your assessment?
No, and I think that's actually part of the Biden strategy, right? To make little noise, but while passing these a 13-figure stimulus. There's 160 million relief checks that have already gone out to the American people. 1.3 million jobs were created since January 25th. They opened up a special enrollment period for healthcare, for Obamacare, and that led to a lot more signups. And then most crucially, in 2021, the Biden administration over-delivered on vaccine rollout, because in mid-January, there was talk that at the rate that the Trump administration was going with vaccine rollouts, that it was going to take 7 years for us to have 70% of the population vaccinated. And so what happened when Biden came in was they discovered that the federal program to deliver vaccines kind of stopped at the last mile. Like it was sort of, like when aid goes into, for instance, in this case, India, but then it gets stuck like at the airports or at the ports. And so And then it was left to local municipalities, counties to figure out how to actually get shots in arms. And so the Biden administration was very impressive in having no playbook, having to start with zero on that last mile and get get people jabbed. And so that's kind of what's going to stand out for me in terms of the first 100 days. And we should point out that the 100 days is a rather arbitrary number. It's arbitrary, but it's a nice round number. But in a lot of ways, it was really impressive because this super popular $2 trillion rescue plan was passed. And I think if it were President Obama, I remember the days of President Obama's leadership. Anytime any sort of budget bill had to get passed, or even just balancing or trying to, fund the government would shut down, or there seemed like there was a steady drumbeat of that. And so not having major political fights capture our attention in passing this $2 trillion rescue plan is pretty impressive. Biden also introduced plans for pretty sweeping immigration reform and this infrastructure bill or infrastructure investment that Simon talked about. And so, a lot has actually happened while Biden himself has made very little noise and has gotten very little coverage compared to Trump. So if we look at the first 100 days sort of in and of itself, he knocked it out of the park, right? But another way to look at it is how well this 100 days situates him for the next 100 days and for the rest of his term, and really for the next 2 years, because we are sort of counting the midterms as a point where the opportunity for a lot of sweeping legislation is going to be lost. I think that's more of an open question because this filibuster in the Senate remains. And I assume that the audience knows that we have this arcane filibuster in the US Senate too. So why don't I just toss it over to you there, Simon, to sort of build on this, like the question of how the 100 days success, the success of the first 100 days situates Biden for governing ahead in the months ahead.
A couple of things about that. I think that's absolutely the question to ask about the 100 days. It's about how much of that political capital you come to office with, particularly when you come to office in times of crisis. How have you let that like sand slip through your hands, or how have you used it to consolidate and really cement a platform for future political success? And I think it's more the latter, right? It's been a very skilled operation, both politically, but now I think is the key point, Elise and Gordon, is that the state has demonstrated it can do things competently again. And it's, I think, again, something that Democrats were talking a lot about, why they have to get this right, because to sort of put up on the wall a compelling counter argument, what's been a mantra of, kind of the neoliberal and particularly since Reagan, that government wasn't solution, government was the problem. Sort of that as a element of American political thinking brought into the American mainstream from the Goldwater tradition of republicanism becoming mainstream under Reagan. I think this 100 days, and particularly the COVID relief package, and the knocking it out of the park, to use your metaphor, on the immunization program, vaccination program, has demonstrated the American state is capable of doing things right when it's run by people of goodwill and people of competence. Number one. The second thing I'd point to is the administration itself. We focus a lot on this here at the US Study Center. We've got a piece of research coming out by our researchers next week. And one of the highlights is I read the draft and you try to abstract away from the details of who's who and what's the big picture here. The big picture is diversity does not mean you are compromising on experience and competence. It's a pretty amazing team that Biden has built. He kept true to his campaign promise on an administration that would look like America. And thus far, I think the 100 days, the runs on the board, to use a cricket metaphor there now, the runs on the board sort of have cemented, I think, something he really wanted to show the world, is that you don't have to compromise on competence and experience in order to build a demographically diverse group. And the number of women and people of color in senior positions in the administration is setting all sorts of records, and something I think we don't give enough attention to, I think, at least here in Australia. And finally, I'll come to the speech to Congress the other night. Above all, I think I was so pleased to hear these words. Biden is trying not just to bring the country back from COVID, but to galvanize it with a sense of purpose and connecting domestic policy to foreign policy. And that is that line from the speech that the United States is engaged in nothing less than a contest for the 21st century. I think I don't think we go back to FDR, but I'd go back to Johnson or maybe to Eisenhower. I think are the presidencies I'm seeing the most parallels with, where the state is going to lead major initiatives, not just the COVID recovery, but building out from that. How is the United States going to compete with China? How is the United States going to lead the world's democracies to show that democracy is not an idea whose time has passed, that it is still the best way of organizing societies around the world, that they can overcome their internal differences, turn that diversity into a strength, and lead the world as it faces its greatest challenges, climate change being chief among them. That I found really empowering and galvanizing, and I kind of commend it to Australian listeners. I haven't heard an articulation of national purpose like that from a US president in a long time. And I was so pleased to hear old Uncle Joe Biden, an old white guy in his late 70s, who clearly is reaching back, I think, to that sense of American greatness that he grew up in the shadow of World War II, through the Cold War years. Part of America being back is America being up for that contest, and I was really particularly sort of energized, frankly, by that part of the
Thank you,
speech.
Simon. I want to, in a minute, take the conversation into foreign policy, because there's a lot there to discuss as well. But before we leave COVID, I think it's probably useful to remember that, in January, before the inauguration, there was a clear assumption that the Biden administration policy was rightly COVID. They had to get it right. We're now in a situation where the United States has administered vaccines, at least one dose, to over 150 million people in just over 3 months. 55% of the eligible population vaccinated. I think 52 are near 48, I guess it is, of the overall population. So just a remarkable accomplishment. But there's also some suggestion that the hard part is yet to come. That there is, a wide pocket of skepticism. There's actually a political party, an entire portion of the U.S. media that's actively preaching against vaccines, and so a growing concern that the U.S. won't be able to hit the bigger targets, the 70%, 80% they need to get to herd immunity, and so despite the success of the first 100 days, the hard part is yet to come. Elise, you're sitting in a state that's probably different than your home state of Missouri, or your where you grew up in Texas. Can you give us a view of how this is breaking down the U.S. in terms of states and parties?
Yeah, the point that we're at with vaccination right now in the United States and the overall vaccination program is now we are beginning to see, now the places where people were lining up for mass vaccinations, like Dodger Stadium here in Los Angeles, they are shutting down. They are, because there isn't that demand anymore. So there's softer demand, and then there's access problems in places, rural places, and poorer places in the United States. And that's along the US-Mexico border, for example, and more remote states, the Dakotas. And so the Biden administration is now going to face kind of the demand problem and the access problem at the same time. I think there's a lot that can be done with the access problem by just getting vaccine to doctors, like local doctors, country doctors, so that they are available at doctors' offices, and then doctors' offices and the doctors and pharmacists that have individual relationships with patients can say, like, this is a good idea. Would you like to have a vaccine when you're there for your annual checkup? Messaging wise, because you are running into more vaccine skepticism, there's people sort of on the fence, and the behavioral economists and behavioral psychologists say that it doesn't work just to tell people just go vote. They won't do that, right? And so you can't kind of say to folks, just get a shot in the arm, just get jabbed, if they already have some resistance or hesitancy. And so the Biden administration, knowing that, from what I've read, is approaching it as like, hey, I understand why you might have some hesitancy and have some questions, but talk to your doctor about it, talk to pharmacists about it. And so there is kind of an active messaging campaign going on now that's informed by some behavioral science, right, to try and get the folks who are on the fence to be persuaded. And then on the other end, on the access problem, just to get that vaccine in all the places to make it easy to get into people's arms. So yeah, it's going to be a slower, I think we're going to see a plateau. But thankfully, the first 50% of the population was able to get vaccinated fast enough such that there haven't been these multiple variants as we've seen in India. Because one of the issues that we were in this race against time, right? It was either get the vaccine in these arms as quickly as possible, or these variants are going to continue to multiply and quadruple, and so or wind up and then continue to spread very easily, as we're seeing in this breathtakingly horrifying situation in India. So yeah, I mean, I from my vantage point am pretty hopeful about it overall, Gordon.
I took the opportunity this week to watch the Oscar-winning movie Nomadland, the Chloe Zhao.
Right, I haven't seen it yet. Yeah.
It's a beautiful movie. It's not necessarily a beautiful portrait of America. I mean, it is the lost and the forgotten, the broken people all throughout the country. And you just take that movie and then figure out how would you get vaccines to those people. It gives you an idea of the scope of the challenge. Simon, obviously, this has been a very different problem from an Australian perspective. I know you and your team have done quite a few events looking at kind of the way the US and Australia have responded to this. Any insights you have on the remaining challenge in the US on COVID?
No, I'm going to defer to Elise on that, Gordon. It is interesting, though. We watch the numbers really carefully, and watching that plateauing in the numbers of people getting vaccinations, and watching it, like so many things in America these days, map onto underlying political preferences as well. The good news for Elise is that she's probably living around a population there in Los Angeles and California more broadly, that is, where the vaccination take rate is probably among the highest in the country. But you wonder about those places in Texas. I also wonder, Gordon, about how many people out there are left to get COVID at this point. And the other thing is just that the issue of the variants came up. It's a huge source of uncertainty for everybody right now, gnawing away at us, just sort of the anxieties that this thing has provoked globally. And we're not out of, a strong sense we're not out of the woods yet, despite, the really great news about the vaccination rate in the US and the way that, our policies here in Australia, essentially sealing off the country from the rest of the world, have actually kept Australia largely, relatively speaking, you might say COVID-free. It's not much of an exaggeration to say that, but just where we are with these variants, Gordon, and your center out there in Perth with your close focus on India, you guys have more visibility on that and the threats that might be posing to the world.
It really has been a sobering couple of weeks, just in terms of the long term on this. I have to confess, 6 months ago, I perceived Australia as having a really remarkable window of opportunity to steal a march on our American friends, our British friends, or European friends, and that we were coming out of the first year of the pandemic having a reputation for being well-governed, efficient, healthy, safe, great medical care, et cetera. And that whether it's for students or tourists or investment, that we would be the go-to place. And unfortunately, our model has required us to have a international messaging that says we're closed. And I've just seen in the last month, the number of tourists returning to the United States, the number of students returning to the United States, it's just kind of skyrocketing. And so in contrast to being a window of opportunity, we might find ourselves trapped in our own beautiful bubble. And meanwhile, countries like the United States might steal ahead. And at least, obviously, you've given a lot of thought of this in your international kind of views on this as well.
Yeah, I just, there's one point that I want to make that we should really think about, and is placing the responsibility in the hands of countries like America and countries like Australia. I mean, watching India, obviously Modi's failed leadership here is breathtaking, and allowing those massive religious rallies and now censoring critics. And then the state of journalism is very bad in India in terms of being able to freely report. Obviously, so much aid from the developed world is going into India now, but gosh, Modi really, you used a cricket analogy, Simon. I'm going to use an American football analogy. He really spiked the football at the 20-yard line. It's just, it's heartbreaking. And we should, of course, do anything we can to help. But I do not think, the point I want to make is that I don't think it's morally sustainable to have a globe in which majority white countries in the world, where everybody's just kind of hanging out and back to normal, like, California, and then other parts of the world with countries that are not majority white isn't, and they aren't back to normal, right? That's not okay. And so I think globally, I know there's something called COVAX, right, where there's more architecture and systemization around who's getting vaccines and who isn't, but it should not be the responsibility or the burden, really, of any one country like America to choose who we give vaccines to, which is what's been kind of happening out of the gate, because the patents have been, American companies, Pfizer and Moderna. And so I just think there's really got to be a global comprehensive plan, more architecture around this.
The
and
announcement,
the Biden team should be stepping back, and it should be really more of a global, a multilateral institution.
So Elise, you're spot on this. And this is where the announcement yesterday from Catherine Tai, who's the U.S. Trade Representative, and those who've done anything with the U.S. Trade Representative office know that they are the high priest of intellectual property rights, and they will defend it down to the tiniest detail in those free trade agreements.
It's too much, right?
She came out and on behalf of the Biden administration announced this plan to remove patents from the COVID vaccines. And basically shamed the European Union into agreeing. So that's a very important step. And it's something that, let's just say we would not have expected, a year ago under a kind of an America first approach to the world. And that gives me a great transition. We've only got about 10 minutes left into foreign policy. We've gone from an era of America first to a full-throated articulation of alliance first without a lot of domestic pushback. One of our colleagues, James Bowen, who's watching, asked me to ask the question about how the ongoing partisan divide we talked to about budgets in the next 100 days is impacting foreign policy. Is that going to impact the U.S. commitment to allies, alliances? Well, let's just start. Big picture, Elise, you spent a long time in Korea and Japan. You've kind of seen firsthand some of the impacts of an America first approach on alliance relationships, particularly in our region, the Indo-Pacific. How is the Biden administration approach looking to you on that front? And then we'll go to you, Simon.
Well, I think overall, as we've seen Blinken and other members of the State Department travel the world, it's sort of like America's back, and diplomacy's back. And except with regard to China, where relations are as sour as I've ever seen them in my life, right? And I was born in 1982, so that makes sense. And I would say overall, my big takeaway after repatriating to the United States about 3 years ago, minus 1 year of COVID in which I was not engaged with the rest of the world really at all. So my 2 years of living in the United States as an American again is that Americans shockingly disregard international news and international politics. It is so myopic. It is stunning how little international news diet I get anymore. And so I guess even as somebody who was so steeped in Korea and Japan and just Northeast Asia in general, I would say because it's been the work of diplomacy and not a lot of flare-ups or these kinds of massive summits, attention-seeking summits that Donald Trump was trying to get with Kim Jong-un, I've paid very little attention to it, honestly. And it's again, it's also, I guess, on the same theme of kind of more quiet under the Biden administration. Though I do worry about some flashpoints to come, like Taiwan, for example, which is more in the news lately.
Simon, your team has given a lot of thought to this, obviously. Your take first on the first 100 days, shifts in American foreign policy. But what are the big issues that we ought to be paying attention to in terms of, going back to James's question, how is domestic politics in the U.S. going to impact foreign policy going forward?
Yeah, well, the couple of things to say, Gordon. One is, there's the very top of the tree, right? The statements by Biden and Blinken in particular, doing an extremely articulate job of connecting the Biden's domestic policy priorities to projections of American strength abroad, that it begins at home. Build Back Better is a foundation, therefore, on which to then project American power and influence. And remember Biden's magic phrase that I'm sure every member of the administration knows, the power of our example, not the example of our power. And I think, so there's a soft power piece to that. But there's also a hard power piece. And that's the piece we're taking a good hard look at. The Biden's defense DOD budget request wasn't as big a cut, right? No one, and it's sort of essentially, it's more or less constant in real terms, or not far from that. For us, though, the big question is less to do with the congressional battle around that. I think there's enough bipartisan support for understanding, hey, the world actually is kind of a bit more dangerous than we might have been thinking earlier. China's on the move, clearly, in technology. I think even the most dovish Democrat would accept that proposition. And so there doesn't seem to be, I think, a lot of political opposition to the sense of, wow, the US really needs to get its act together in terms of shoring up, the things that have made it great as in a hard power sense. So it's in the post-war era. Getting back to that, one of the real issues, Gordon, is something we're focused on, is the usual inter-service rivalries that happen inside DOD. How much of that money will actually get committed to the innovation in American defense technology and the deployment, from Australia's national interest in parts of the world far, far away from the American homeland, out this far away, in Australia, in the region. And that's the question we're focused on. And the answer is, we don't know, we will see. It is nonetheless reassuring to see the enthusiasm with which they've gone at things like the Quad. The Japanese Prime Minister was the first big head of government to head of government meeting that Biden took. That Blinken and Austin did the North Asia sweep very early on. All that's reassuring, but the proof of the pudding is, those dollars and the kit that it buys and where it is deployed on the Earth's surface. That's one thing that we here at the US Study Center are laser focused on and tracking very, very closely.
Go ahead.
Go ahead.
So one of the things that struck me in the speech that President Biden delivered to the joint session of Congress last week was saying, it's not enough to say America's back. We have got to demonstrate that America is staying back. And we're going to do that together with allies. So one of the things that the previous president just never understood is again, in addition to what you were saying, Simon, is not only is the strength of America and the strength of its example, but it's also in the networks that it built, right? Its alliances, the international systems, the laws, the institutions, the standards and norms. That's where the real strength is. And so a unitary kind of America is great, America first kind of policy ignored what really made America more influential. And so that sheer recognition alone, base competence, is probably encouraging. But I would note that in contrast to the first 100 days, there's a lot of issues. Elise mentioned the cross-straits relationship in Taiwan. South China Sea continues to be an issue, an area that Elise focused on for a long time. North Korea, has never been known to be quiet for too long, and there's some evidence of rumbling on that front. Border issues on Ukraine. So there's just an awful lot of issues on the foreign policy front that were not on the forefront in the first 100 days that are likely to be in the weeks and months to come. Elise, I'm sorry, I cut you off there.
And what was I going to say? Oh, actually, I was going to say, because yes, now I'm back to it. I wanted to just to respond that in the 21st century now, I think it is so crucial that governments really do pay attention to where they have opportunity for soft power instead of sort of hard military strength, right? And that goes back to my point about leadership in public health and leadership in getting us out of this pandemic, because America's R&D and European R&D really got us to these vaccines so quickly, but unless it's distributed evenly or distributed and distributed more quickly to the rest of the world, then we are squandering an opportunity for real leadership, really, and showing, not telling, setting by example in the way that Biden is referring to. This is a huge opportunity, and it shouldn't be spiked.
Yeah, let me just quickly jump on that. I just think the attention given to India as a Quad partner, and as a everybody waiting for India to emerge as a critical counterweight by sheer dint of its size to China in the region. Well, hell, what better way to earn the gratitude of generations of Indians and to swamp them with whatever we can get there. And we're talking a country of north of 1 billion people in population. Like, sending a C-17 with some respirators ain't going to get it done. You know what I mean?
Right.
This needs to, I know we're taking care of our own populations first, and I understand in democratic societies, where you got the threat of electoral sanction for failing to do that. But the capacity that exists for producing vaccine at scale, and if we can get it into the Indian subcontinent as quickly as we possibly can, there's a really important geostrategic imperative for that as well.
Simon, you're spot on, and as I anticipated, the hour went by very quickly. I would highlight one thing, that on the 12th of March, or 13th of March here, there was a virtual Quad leaders meeting between President Biden, our Prime Minister Scott Morrison, Prime Minister Modi in India, Prime Minister Suga in Japan, which I don't know has gotten a lot of coverage in domestic politics in the US, but was really quite significant to get something up that quickly in a new administration for the first time ever. And not only to have a joint statement that came out, but a specific agenda for cooperation on the areas that you've talked about, obviously vaccines, production and distribution, climate change, which I'm afraid we didn't get to today, but also technology, which we've touched on in that front. And then again, Lisa, in your realm, quite a remarkable thing to get an op-ed from the leaders of India, Japan, Australia, and the United States, the joint op-ed in the Washington Post. How'd you like to be on the op-ed board approving that one coming in?
Yeah.
Hey, look, we're really out of time. I just want to give a final word to both Elise and then finally to Simon. The first 100 days went fast, and we've talked about where we had a little bit of headspace to think about it. Let's apply that headspace to the next 100 days. What is going to be the touchstones for you? We get to early August. We're past the summer months. What should we be focused on? What are the key trends that you're observing? What's going to be important in the next 100 days? Elise, we'll start with you, and then we'll wrap up with Simon.
I just think if the filibuster in the U.S. Senate remains in place, that so much ambition is going to be unmet. And right now, the big question is, we don't know the version of events that's going to play out, whether Biden is going to be an LBJ-like or an FDR-like figure with tons of transformative legislation, or will these past 100 days be the high watermark? So that's kind of my point about the 100 days. My point about the U.S. going forward is that we have a real future me problem, because the fate of American democracies sort of, and the biggest issue for American democracy is the fate of American democracy. Like, that is the biggest issue in American politics.
Well
the
said.
system survived Trump, but he was clumsy, right? He had a lot of clumsy efforts to subvert the system, but the threat to the system is really far from over.
Fantastic.
Wow.
Simon, last word to you.
Hard to improve on that. Watch the infrastructure bill. Hugely significant. If you thought 1.9 trillion was big, this thing's, this first digits of 2. We'll see what gets through. But I'm also watching very carefully. What did Trump teach us? I'll just echo your point. Democracy is never set and forget. Trump reminded us of that, and right now in real time, down at the state level and below the fold, from where Australian viewers at least are watching, there is an awful lot going on, as there kind of always is, in US politics, about some very fundamental questions about the state of US democracy.
Well, fantastic, Simon. As always, it's a pleasure. We look forward to your hosting this time next month. And Elise,
up on the top.
Indeed. Thank you so much. We
But will you have a guest better than me? I mean,
well, that's my point.
how are you going to top this?
I doubt it.
Thank you so much. It's late in LA. For those of our viewers who haven't been following Elise on Twitter or on TED Talks Daily Podcast, she's amazing. Just Google her. I think her Twitter handle is at Elise Hu, not Hugh, but WHO. And you'll learn a lot. Thank you, Elise. We greatly appreciate it. Thank you, Simon.
Thank you,
Look forward
guys.
to next month.
It was a pleasure.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Have a great Friday. See you later.
See you.
Bye.
Bye.